Welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare, Chatman,
and me, Tova, Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Welcome to Constitutional Chats, co-hosted by me, Janine Turner. And if you want to know more about me, you can visit JanineTurner.com. It has all my bios and all the other things I'm doing. But I'm also founder and co-president of Constituting America. And we founded 10 years ago, and we're thrilled to be with you today. Cathy Gillespie is co-president of Constituting America. She was a chief of staff on the Hill forever. She is the most wonderful person with whom to work. I called her in the grocery store and said, hey, we need to start a foundation. And here we are. So Cathy Gillespie is also one of the prestigious 16 people selected out of all Americans to lead the semi-quincentennial celebration of 250 years of our country. So she's just an extraordinary person. Cathy Gillespie, please say hi.
Hi, everybody. We're glad that you're here.
Okay, and Tova Love Kaplan. Tova Love Kaplan is our National Youth Director for Constituting America, and she's just so brilliant and so outstanding. Wait till you get to know her a little bit today. And she's 16 years old and lives in Illinois. She currently serves, as I said, as National Youth Director for Constituting America, and she runs the National Youth Advisory Council, like a CEO. CEOs have nothing on Tova Love Kaplan. Truly, I mean that. She is a right brain, left brain. I can speak. A right brain, left brain, brilliant young woman. She is a 3-time winner of the We the Future contest. She won in 8th grade in the entrepreneurial category, where she actually created a marketing plan for Constituting America. She won for PSA, which is a short commercial for Know Your Rights, Read the Constitution. She starred in it, wrote it, produced it. Everything was wonderful. And this year she won for creating a STEM in the STEM category, where she created an app. We're going to have that up and running in another couple of months. So she is passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. And we're just so lucky to have Tova Love Kaplan with us on the show as a co-host. Say hello, Tova Love Kaplan.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming, and I hope you're all staying safe and healthy.
Yes, very true. And we love getting on the phone with Tova and Dakare, who can't be with us today, or at least not yet. And we talk to them about, hey, what category should we do? They're just part of this whole process, producing the show, helping us market the show, as well as any question that they write I ask is from their own brilliant intellect. And now our special guest for our hot topic, which is Federalist Paper 10, is Adam Carrington, is our great guest today. He's Associate Professor of Politics at Hillsdale College. Adam graduated summa cum laude from Ashland University, woohoo, where he received his master's and then went on to receive his PhD from Baylor University. Hey, Adam, my brother's a Baylor grad.
Oh, sick 'em Bears.
Yeah. Since 2014, Adam has been teaching courses at Hillsdale College on the Constitution, constitutional law, politics and literature, and the American presidency. Professor Morrissey, we've had him on our show before, tells us Adam is the most popular professor on campus. That's cool. That's hard to achieve. Adam published his first book in 2017 entitled Justice Stephen Field's Cooperative Constitution of Liberty. Wow, that sounds fascinating. His publications predominantly concern matters of constitutional law, including articles in Journal of Supreme Court History, Journal of American Political Thought, Presidential Studies Quarterly, and Journal of American Legal History. So yay, our constitutional scholar, Mr. Adam Carrington. Welcome to the show, Mr. Adam Carrington.
It's a pleasure. Glad to be here.
So, Adam Carrington, Federalist Paper number 10. I think that, Cathy and I, when we first launched Constituting American, for all of you that are watching today, we launched in 2010. And within the first few months, we're going to create a contest. And then we were on Fox promoting the contest, or CNN, or wherever we went. We're going to have a contest. And then we're like, we're going to do a 90-day study. Let's do a 90-day study. And then we said, let's take a bus trip all across the country and film all the winners. And we did all that. In 6 or 7 months, we accomplished everything, including having the documentary that we filmed going all over the country. Juliet and I sat next to each other and edited it. I think she was 11. And we had it in the schools by Constitution Day. So one of the things we did, our 90-day study, which why I'm saying all this, was the first 90-day study we ever had, which is on our website, was on the Federalist Papers. And so I said, Cathy, you and I should write an essay too. So every night, I don't know how we had that energy way back then. We would write an essay every night on the Federalist Papers, which there are 85 of them. And they, just so everyone knows, and I'm going to toss it to you, Mr. Carrington, they were opinion editorials published in the newspaper to explain the Constitution, because there was a lot of fear about the Constitution. People needed to understand what they meant by what was in the Constitution. And what's an opinion editorial? It's an essay, and the essay was printed in the newspapers. That was the social media of the day. So, Mr. Carrington, I'm going to toss it to you and let you give us a general, scope of Federalist Paper 10, written by James Madison, and then we will dive in, and Tova's going to ask a question, Cathy's going to ask a question, I will have questions, and our viewers, our listeners, if you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A. Okay, Adam Carrington, most popular professor on the campus at Hillsdale College, you're on.
That's very nice of Dr. Morrissey. He might be overstating things at least a little bit, but that's very kind of him. Yeah, thanks for having me. And at least as a way of introducing Federalist 10, a way to think about them too is the objections to the Constitution, the worries about the Constitution really could have sank it. These actually papers came out while the state of New York and other states were debating whether to ratify the Constitution or not, and therefore these whole papers were meant to defend it. And what Federalist 10 is part of is a larger section. It's really Federalist Paper 2 through about 15, where it's trying to argue, why is a union good? Why is it better for us to be 13 united states as one country rather than maybe break up into 3, 4, or even 13? And one of them, one of the reasons that's brought up, and the one the Federalist 10 focuses on, is this concept of faction. That what Madison will do in the course of this essay is first tell you what's bad about factions. Why should we worry about them? 2, he'll tell you why, what they are, what actually the definition is. And then he'll go through very logically, how do we deal with them in a Republican form of government? And we'll give you ways that don't work, listing them out, and then finally say how they do work, with the ultimate goal of saying the way we have, having us as one united republic is actually going to be better for our system of government and better for the American people now and long term, than these other options that are out there that would split us into several countries or even 13 countries.
The famous quote from this paper is, "Liberty is to faction what air is to fire," right? Mm-hmm. Isn't it? It's in this one. And I quote that all the time. And it's interesting. You can look at that 2 different ways. I mean, it might be interesting for you to expound upon this a little bit. Liberty is to faction what air is to fire. So what they're talking about is, what does air do? Air creates a fire. And so you can't have a fire unless you have air. You can see that positively for faction or negatively for faction. I've always used it, in a positive sense, that, we need to have peaceful, differing points of views where we come together. But also, fire can be really dangerous. And if factions leading all this breath and air into fire, it could consume us. So I think you said that in Federalist Paper 10, he points out the ways it works and the ways it doesn't work. But it's all correlated, I think, in that really interesting quote. Because how do you think he meant it? Because it can certainly go both ways. Or did he mean it both ways?
I would say that fundamentally, he has a negative view of factions, but believes that they are the downside of something else very good. And so maybe a way to answer about that quote is to first say, what are factions? And he defines them pretty clearly. He says they can be a majority or a minority. So it can be 1% of the population, 20, 60, it can be 80% of the population. What drives them? An impulse of passion, he says. And by the way, you already know that's going to be at least somewhat negative, because has anyone ever said to you, man, you acted really impulsively there, good job, right? That's not typically the case. And then but what does it do? What is this impulse of passion on the part of some subset of the population? What are they trying to do? It says they're trying to do something that either hurts the rights, the life, liberty, or property of other people, or is generally against the common good, hurts what's good for us as a whole, as a people. And so I think what he's saying there is, if factions are bad, and I think he does think intrinsically they're bad, because he actually says that they result in killing republics. They end up being the downfall of republics, and we could maybe talk about that, how he means that. But what he goes on to say is, okay, well, one way you could get rid of the problem is to get rid of liberty. If you got rid of liberty, you would get rid of factions, because people wouldn't be able to act on their rights violating beliefs at all. And what he says is, the moment you have liberty, you'll have factions like air to fire. And the negative way to think about that is, if you got rid of air, yes, you'd get rid of fire, but what else would you get rid of if air was gone? Life. And his argument is, if you got rid of liberty, you'd get rid of faction, but guess what you would have done? He says you would have gotten rid of the very reason we established government in the first place, to protect people. And that's why he actually says it's a cure that's worse than the disease. So I think what he basically says is, we have to live with faction because we want to protect and respect liberty, but we can't turn a blind eye to the fact that liberty can be abused by people who are by these things called factions themselves.
So liberty equals life, which is, I guess, then that parallels and correlates the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty. Never really saw it that way before. See, Tova, see what we learned? So if he thinks liberty is life, then that makes the Declaration of Independence life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It really sort of encapsulates all that, doesn't it?
And also, give me liberty or give me death, because liberty is life, right?
Good. Yeah, Tova, go ahead and ask the next question. That's really good, Tova.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just was excited because there's always so many.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So I was, when Cathy and Janine and Dakare and I were like talking about, and I guess Lisa too, we were talking about, we wanted to do a series on the Federalist Papers, and we were trying to figure out what the most influential and like most important ones to talk about were. And this was like the top choice. Like, we chose 4 out of the many, many papers. And then this was like, came up as being one that we had to talk about, like as just a very long lasting and impactful paper. So what about this Federalist paper makes it so memorable, makes it so historical, and makes it one of the most influential?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say probably at least 2 things that I can think of off the top of my head. One is that it defends whether we can have a large country or not. And 2, it defends how can we deal with conflict in a realistic way when human beings are imperfect. And I think that a subset of why that's important is early on in this Federalist paper, Madison points out something that he and Hamilton and Jay, the other authors of these papers, point out in other papers, which is republics have a bad name at this point in history. And, popular governments, rule by the people, has a bad name in the world. And you'd think, why on earth would that be, right? But part of it was results. Hamilton will, or not Hamilton, pardon me, Madison will later in this essay say, democracies have been as short in their life as they've been violent in their death. So there's something about republics or something, or about popular government ruled by the people that just hasn't been working. And if you believe, as the Declaration of Independence does, that just governments rule by consent of the governed, you've got a problem if what you think is a just government isn't working. And Federalist 10 is, I think, one of the most important contributions in how it deals with faction, to say this is how a republic not only is theoretically just because it recognizes the equal rights of all human beings, but here's how we can tweak the way it works in a way that tries to address all the problems that have given it a bad name, and have been such a bad name that a lot of people who support tyranny, rule by one despot, rule by a few nobles, have been saying, look, we shouldn't have this kind of government. And I think Federalist 10 is one of the more effective articulations of how we can get past that problem and really make republics more workable, and therefore government by, for, and of the people more possible in the real world.
Do you have a follow-up, Tova, to that?
I guess not a direct follow-up, and it's fine if you can't answer this because this is more a historical-based question. But I know a lot of people, or at least most people, have been noticing that we are a very, very divided country, which is part of the issue that Constituting America tries to address through our initiatives like civil-civic conversation. But, you know, almost anybody can acknowledge that we're a very, very divided country, and a lot of like animosity towards each other, unfortunately, because of political views. And it also, you know, anyone who studies constitutional history knows that they were not very unified back then either. They were always attacking each other in the press, and, you know, they could barely, you know, fighting with each other over the state of government. And I was wondering, has there ever been a period in American history where people were more unified, or has America fundamentally been a nation with factions because of the nature of a republic?
That's a great question, and I'll try to answer briefly, because obviously I'm not going to bore you with the entire history of America. I'd be bad at that, but I think that there have been greater and lesser eras of unity, and don't always mistake how harsh people are with each other, with how divided they are. Sometimes you fight the worst with your best friends. And I would look, for example, to, the 1790s, where there were just the election of 1800 that the 1790s led to, the accusations made by Thomas Jefferson against John Adams, those were the two running, were unbelievable, on par with any nasty thing that's said today. And I don't think that they were as far apart as people often claim. But they were fighting over, we agreed on the Declaration of Independence. We were actually helped write it together. We disagree on how to apply it, on how to work it out. But because they were so caught up in what had been a friendship, this temporarily ruined it. You see them fighting. At the same time, you know, a lot of people say we've never been so divided as we are now. The Civil War, right, where literally part of the country tried to leave, and there was the bloodiest conflict, at least in American losses, ever. So I think there have been better and worse. I think the better question to ask than how angry people are at each other is, what are they fighting about? And the more fundamental questions they're fighting about, you know, it's one thing to argue about tax policy. Should the tax rate be 20 or 40 or 60% or something else? It's a different thing to argue, is government to be ruled by the people, by a king or someone else? It's much more fundamental to be arguing, is the purpose of government to secure rights and liberty, or is it to, enforce a certain religion? And so I think the better question to ask is less, again, how hard we're fighting, and more ask how deep are the questions that we're fighting about. I think that's a better idea of the actual level of division.
I want to go to Cathy for a question and a follow-up question. I kind of like doing it that way. It's a new thing. I just started it this last moment. But Mr. Carrington, tell us where, I think another part of Tova's question was, when has it worked? And, you know, I'll tell you a story I heard that I think was really interesting. It was talking about the chain of command. And I think this was, in the 70s sometime. So this is a generalization. You may know what I'm talking about. And it was President, Vice President, Speaker of the House. And it was during a Republican presidency. And the question came up about whether the Speaker of the House was going to be next in line. And the Speaker of the House was a Democrat. And he said, if it comes to the point that I will be the next president, I will resign because I'm an opposite party and I wouldn't want to throw a new party onto the people. So in other words, he would have given it to a Republican. And any way you look at that, okay, that's thinking about, you know, the will of the majority, the popular opinion. That's just so giving. It's not this, you know, to me that's a time, I look back at the 70s and go, oh, you know, except for Nixon. But, you know, there was that incident that came from that, where they actually, I thought that was really amazing that he would give up his opportunity to be the president because he wouldn't want to force his party on to because the other party had actually been in office. I thought that was pretty fascinating. Maybe an example of when it worked. But is there a time in our country when it actually worked?
I think as far as the basic fundamentals of us being Americans in a way that transcends Republican or Democrat, or in the past Federalist Democratic Republican or Whig Democrat, those are all the major parties that have been around, I think has been true of more instances of our history than less. And even the instance I used of Jefferson and Adams, one of the extraordinary things about the election of 1800 was that for the first time, a party lost that was in power, the Federalists and John Adams, and they went home. They just went home and tried to win next time. And Jefferson, when he came into power, instead of burning and pillaging all of his enemies, he said, we are all Federalists, we are all Democrats. A difference of opinion is not a difference of fundamental principle. So I actually remember in 2008 when President Obama was elected, I was friend with a man from another country who said, do you realize how extraordinary it is that the Republicans are just going to go home? They're going to be mad. They're going to say mean things, but they're just going to go home. He goes, in my country, I won't say what one it was, he says, our guys would be holding up in the White House and shooting at anyone trying to change the government, even if they legitimately lost. So I think if you look at history and if you look at men like Henry Clay, in the early Republic period, who was the great compromiser and really worked constantly, even to make the slavery issue not divide the country the way it ultimately did. If you look at the latter half of the 19th century, where there was massive divides as the country was industrializing, it hasn't always been pretty. But we've generally, except for the Civil War, settled our differences by discussion and elections and the normal forms of free government. And that's extraordinary. It's extraordinary that, as Lincoln says, ballots have replaced bullets. And that is makes us more human, that makes us more peaceful. And even when we've gotten nasty and awful, fundamentally, except for the Civil War, that's been our answer. So I think most of American history, that's worked better than not.
The peaceful transfer of power. And of course, the Europeans, the people all around the world actually could not believe that George Washington, out of his own initiative, because it wasn't part of the Constitution yet, he could have been president until, you know, he was 90 years old. Out of his own initiative, he handed over the presidency after 8 years. Nobody could believe that.
Yeah,
it was really one of those moments.
Yeah, if I could mention something on that, two things very quickly. One, Napoleon, the French leader, allegedly, as he was exiled after trying to conquer the world, basically said, France wanted me to be their Washington. And by that, he meant wanted me to give up power, having established order. And the implicit idea was I couldn't do it. The other is I imagine there's some fans of the musical Hamilton out there, myself included. And one of the great songs on that is One Last Time, where George Washington declares that he's going to leave. He's going to set aside power willingly. And one thing that song keeps saying is we're going to teach him how to say goodbye. And it's an extraordinary act of statesmanship for Washington to not hold on to power till he dies, because he sets up the idea that power is limited in practice, not just in theory. And he really sets up the idea that the institutions like the Constitution and the Congress and the presidency and the courts, these are all supposed to live on beyond any one man. And that's one of Washington's greatest contributions, if not his greatest.
Very true. Okay, Kathy, I'm going to give you a question and follow-up question.
Well, thank you. Madison does talk so much about faction in this paper. And I think these days, when we think about faction, I mean, I know when I think about it, the first thing I think of is a political party. But I'm just wondering if in his day, when he was writing about faction, what were some examples that he might have had in his mind as to current day, for him, factions? I mean, what specifically do you think he was talking about? I know he defines it a little bit in the paper, but are there some examples?
Right. I think the way to think about the relationship, I'll say first, between factions and parties is the question of less about whether they call themselves a party and more, what does a party do? Does a party act in the ways that his definition gives forward? Does it act out of an impulse of passion? And does it do so in a way that violates the rights of others? And I think what he was worried about was the proliferation of 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 parties that could be so small and therefore so narrow that they could only look out for themselves and not look out for the good and rights of others. And I think that he saw at least this acting out in some ways, in two ways, I would say. One, a little more general, I think he saw within the states, and he basically says this indirectly in Federalist 10, a lot of factious activity. So one example he gives in other places is the difference between debtors and creditors, those who are lending money and those who owe money. And one of the biggest problems that brought the Constitutional Convention about was Shays' Rebellion, where a lot of farmers who had gotten, it's a question whether they were bad loans or not, couldn't pay them and said, oh, you know how we can stop being collected on for our debts? We can march with pitchforks and shut down the government, shut down the courts violently. So that would be something that would look like a faction. And actually, interestingly, even though he was from Virginia, the way he sometimes talked about slavery was to talk about that as being a kind of faction. The other was based on economic status, rich, poor, this being obviously based on race. And so I think he didn't like the idea of the smaller political units, states, counties, other things being left to themselves, because he thought these factions of the rich versus the poor, the white and black race, even other things like religion, were more in danger of overwhelming freedom, liberty, and the common good. So I think he had a number of things in mind that come out here and other places.
Well, thank you. And I guess my follow-up question would be, I know this paper starts out, it says same subject continued, and he's writing on the same subject that Alexander Hamilton, I think, had written on in Federalist Paper 9. Were there any differences between Hamilton and Madison's views on this subject?
I would say, at least at this point in their careers, fundamentally, no. um, Federalist 9, and they talked about these papers together. They didn't randomly write them. They conversed. Hamilton was the main editor. And what Federalist 9 really does is takes the bigger picture that republics have had a bad rap, a bad history, what I kind of talked about before, and that there's been what Federalist 9 calls advances in the science of politics, things like representative government, separation of powers, lifetime judges, that have improved the science of politics and made republics better. He then mentions, Hamilton does, the enlargement of the orbit, he says. If you see it in most copies, it's in all caps, meaning a larger republic. And what Madison ultimately does is retraces a few steps, but then ultimately explains what Hamilton kind of leaves in nascent stage, this idea of why a larger republic would help against the dangers of faction, and really expands upon it. So no, I think they're similar. I think a little later in their career, Hamilton was a little more nervous about popular government and its excesses than Madison was. But here, I think there's pretty fundamental agreement. There's, if anything, there's a quantitative difference of degree, not a qualitative difference of any kind of fundamental principle.
Okay, so there's this argument all the time. It's one of the questions when we give speeches, are we a republic or a democracy? And this is such a debate amongst adults. And the common misconception is that we are a democracy. Our form of government is a republic. And, you know, I always talk about how the Pledge of Allegiance, if you say it, you know, pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic. But we don't think about that because we're learning it when we're 5, you know. So it's by rote. We don't really put the words together, but it says republic in that. Talk to me, if you would, and talk to all of us about their differences, why they felt the republic was important instead of a democracy, and the differences between democracy and republic. And I would think that's a faction in itself, I suppose. It's a category. How would we, can you just tell us how they would have thought what they felt about a democracy and why they chose a republic?
Right, and in some ways, the confusion on this has gotten because we don't define our terms clearly. We kind of conflate the terms. In fact, I've seen speeches where people will just use the terms interchangeably, but the founders saw it as massively different. Both were the same in the source of power. Both were popular governments, governments of the people, where the people ultimately held rule, were ultimately sovereign. But the difference that they thought was huge was how the people exercise their power. And in a democracy, power is exercised directly. The people would do all of the debating, all of the legislating, all of the executing. They would do every part of government directly, kind of like an old New England township, that old model that I don't think is around much anymore, but that Alexis de Tocqueville, the Frenchman, noted a lot in his Democracy in America. Republics are still government where the people rule, but it's through representation, where we elect a government. We choose a government that through whom we delegate our power in a limited fashion. And the founders were decidedly against democracy and decidedly for republics. And why is twofold. One, and both had to do with what they thought were the problems of popular government. The fact that factions tend to act out of an impulse of passion, they thought was typical of groups of people in general, that people together can tend to be impulsive. They can tend to be act on the spur of the moment, not think long term. And they can do so often in a way that goes after the less powerful. And the idea is, first, if you have representatives, how are you going to elect them? You're going to try to elect the best, the brightest, the most virtuous, the most up and top tip citizens. And that they are going to be not merely people that reflect the popular will, but maybe people that can moderate it, make it more reasonable, say, we're going to try to be the best version of ourselves, and electing people to represent us, electing the best people is a good way to do that. And so that's one reason. The second idea is you can have a larger republic than you can have a democracy. Imagine getting millions of people into one place to debate and vote. It's not going to happen. But a representative government, you can have 435 House members, 100 senators, represent the whole country and come together and debate. And the argument there is small democracies, small governments tend to be more homogenous. They tend to think alike, act alike, feel alike, and therefore they tend to be more easier to gang up on the little guy and hurt the rights of the little guy. And a representative government, because it can be larger, can be more diverse. And when you have more diversity in thought, in background, in belief, coming to a majority consensus on something requires compromise. It requires thinking of each other more as human beings than as race or class or gender or other things like that. And therefore, it allows more of a chance of the right choice by the rights of all to be made. So I think those are, that's a huge topic. So I was trying to be succinct as I can, but I think that's the beginning point. Yeah.
So there are a lot of people that I think it's interesting that you said democracies only work if they're small, because that was going to be my follow-up question, which is, wow, how could we even have one of those with 350 million people in America, a democracy where everybody comes together and decides? It would be mass chaos. So you answered the question, but it's interesting to me that people who want democracy in this country tend to be bigger government type of people. So it seems to be incongruent. It doesn't go together because it's interesting to me, because democracies, they consider America to be democracies and they want bigger and bigger government. So what is their definition of democracy then?
I think the way that this can make some sense is if you go to the progressive era, and I don't mean self-described progressives on the left side of the political spectrum today. There was a self-defined progressive movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and they did two things to try to make this work. They, on the more democracy side, they started to put in things like referendums and initiatives, and people may live in states that have those, where the people directly vote on a law, whether to make it a law, or the people directly vote on whether a law should be approved or not that a legislature has passed, and recalls too. And they did this all in the name of democracy. Why not have the people directly decide on laws in some way, shape, or form? And you're right. How does that square with often that is made in the argument for a more active government, a government that does more? This is where counterintuitively the same people often were in favor of a fairly large bureaucracy. And what they said is we shouldn't have the typical separation of powers that the Constitution had, legislative, executive, and judicial, with the people underneath it all. They said we should have a democracy where the people are more directly involved, but it should be very vague. The people should broadly say, do we want cleaner air, safer streets, more workplace safety for workers? And then what they said is we are going to need a fairly expansive bureaucracy of administrators to work out all the complicated details, and to set up a system where they take the broad ideas that the people in more direct democracy say they want, and they're going to write the regulations, they're going to execute them, they're going to have their own courts to adjudicate them. And that was the way that you could have a more direct democracy and a bigger bureaucracy, is the people make more broad decisions, and the bureaucracy of experts does a lot more of the actual governing than the elected officials themselves.
Fascinating. Well said. Well said. It's just really interesting to hear you describe that. And I think the danger is when it's broad. If you have a representative and you can talk to the representative and really get specific about what you're looking for. If it's broad, you lose the power then about how that's really interpreted. And that seems to me to be rather dangerous. But I want to get to Tova and Cathy for other questions. But I will say, I think in California, their propositions do become law. Am I correct in that? But in Texas, propositions do not become law. So I love the way Texas does it, because they'll give you a proposition in the ballot, and you can say, hey, I'm for this or not for this, but it doesn't actually become a law. But don't they become laws in California?
A number of other states. I'm not familiar closely with California. I wouldn't be surprised. But I know a lot of other states do have where it becomes actual law. And you're right, by the way, that there's the worry there that there's this gap between will the bureaucrats who are not elected by the people start to do their own thing. And that's one of the concerns. By the way, whatever your politics are, left, right, center, the worry about that system is that the people's will, whatever it is, wherever it lies in the partisan politics, doesn't get followed the way it maybe necessarily could under the founders' system in the Constitution.
Interesting. So we really, to summarize that, we really have more power over what's happening if we have a republic. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, Tova, we have Tova. Yeah. Constitution. Tova and Cathy, we have 13 minutes left.
Great. So,
ahead,
thank you. So we had a great audience question from Ron Mayer, which was a really great point. He used the quote, extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests, less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, and says, following that logic, would it be better if we had more than two parties like the European style? And I know you mentioned earlier in the webinar that Madison was very worried about the idea of multiple parties and kind of dilute, like making it too, if there's multiple parties, the interests would be too specific. And could you just elaborate more on that and answer his question? And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's his core answer is why I was saying republics are better as far as being larger for Madison, is that the extended sphere means you have a greater diversity of interests, which means nobody in the country is in every quality or characteristic a majority member. You may be a majority religiously or racially or some other thing, but you're never a majority on everything you are. And that means that you're always going to have to cobble together majorities in order to have a winning coalition, which means you're going to have to work with people not like you, which means you're going to be more moderate. Now, to get to his question, does that mean more parties are better? I think Madison would say no. And here's why. There's two ways to get a majority out of a bunch of minorities. And the system that multiple parties does is to say, let's hold the elections, and then everyone try to work out who's going to work with who. Now, here's the thing. If you just won an election with maybe a very hard line, I won 20% of the vote, and I'm going to stick to my guns, often that is getting enough of those parties together to govern is going to pull people to the hard left or the hard right or whatever the extremes are. And we see this, I think, in a lot of systems with multiple parties. You often have to appease some very tiny party with fairly radical views to get over the hump, to get to 51%. What happens with our system? It's not that those groups don't go away. It's that they have to compromise before the election to be part of one of the major parties. In other words, the party itself has to moderate everyone before election day, which then I think tends to mean that the parties themselves, when they get in power, are going to be more moderate than they would be otherwise. Now, I know that seems hard to imagine sometimes in our politics, but I think it's actually true compared to other places. Our two-party system is a party of factions that are forced to moderate themselves in order to be a player. Whereas afterwards, I think if you do it the other way, you tend to have more extreme parties and more extreme politics. And by the way, that's often why people say, I don't have a choice. Yeah, that sometimes feels that way, but the other option is, as far as imperfection, is to go so far the other way that your choices get almost so extreme to be ungovernable.
So that's what party platforms are all about, right? They create a platform.
Yes, if people read them. Yeah. And that used to be the case. It used to be, by the way, I mean, this is dipping into another topic about the presidency, that the party defined itself and then picked someone that was most like it as a whole, as opposed to now with the primary system where it basically becomes a contest among presidential candidates to remake the party in his or her own image, which I think is to be honest, for me, a little more problematic. But that's why platforms are supposed to say, I know that no one in the party is going to perfectly agree. What can we come together and agree on? And that is, I think, Federalist 10 in miniature when it's done right.
That's really interesting. So the way it used to be done is the platform of all the different groups that Tova was asking about have come together, right or left, but there are many within that group, so they come together and create a party platform of what they're looking for, and then they choose a candidate based off that. But now the candidate is chosen first.
Yeah, so why do we have party conventions? Well, right now they're kind of just beauty pageants mixed with infomercials, right? To try to pitch the candidate. It used to be actually the party leaders chosen by party people came together and decided who their candidate was going to be. And it was based off the idea that we need to find a coalition of a candidate and candidates that are going to get elected across the country. And guess what? The country's really diverse, religiously, ethnically, other things. And so we're going to have to really accommodate and moderate ourselves to where is the country as a whole, which again, I think Madison would look at and say, you know, I don't like these small factious parties, but that seems a little closer to the kind of moderation that protects us from you know, some of the more extreme elements that politics can be prey to.
I want to go to Cathy here to close this out, but it seems to me that the way the conventions used to be more like a republic then, and that a representative would go and look at everybody and represent the people and what they're looking for and pick. And now it seems more of a democracy in that the majority of the people are picking the candidate. Okay, yeah. Cathy.
Well, I was just curious, you know, since this is Federalist Paper number 10, it's one of the first, really, out of 85. It's in the top, you know, the first 10 that they wrote. Would you say that this is one of the largest concerns? I found it fascinating when you said they were coordinating with each other on how they were going to address different topics and who was going to address the topics. Was this a really burning concern with people that were worried about the Constitution and that they felt they needed to jump right in and defend this early on? Or would you say, were they writing these in order of some of the biggest concerns? Or how do you think they came to put this in the top 10 of the first 10 that they wrote?
Yeah, I would say I think they were trying to do two things at once. One is address certain concerns, and that's why sometimes the Federalist Papers will be a little repetitive, because they were reading the anti-Federalist Papers, the other articles and essays that were saying, no, you shouldn't approve this Constitution, it's bad. And one of the biggest ones was, this is going to turn us into a consolidated nation with no states, no local governments, et cetera, et cetera. And so they were trying to combat that because that was one of the scariest things. So deal with that first. But the other, I think, is logically. I think the brilliance of these guys was they could think strategically and logically at the same time. And I think the idea was, first, let's establish that we should be a country together. First, let's establish that it's good that we be America, and then we can move on to how the Constitution itself is a good realization of being an America. Because what's interesting is nothing specific about the Constitution is mentioned in Federalist 10. No specific clause, no amendment. But I think they had to prove we should be one country together before they could move on and say, and this Constitution is the way to do it. So I think that's the other reason why it's early on.
Great point.
So we have 5 minutes. Cathy, you want to ask a follow-up question? Or Tova, or do you want to go to someone who's giving us a question?
Oh, go ahead, Cathy.
No, I'm going to go back to Tova. That's fine.
Sure. So I just kept thinking about your answer to the previous question I asked, because she was just really fascinating about the multiple parties. And at least when I was in my high school history class, so not the most comprehensive, but I'd like to think I know a little bit American history. We were learning about how when the country was first founded, we didn't have necessarily the two-party system in place. Like, George Washington was just George Washington. He wasn't George Washington, the Federalist or the Democratic Republican. He eventually became Federalist, but like when he was president, they were like, we just like him. The party system wasn't as entrenched as it was today. So that's kind of, I guess, the climate that they wrote these papers in. And Washington, in fact, was very against factions, as you mentioned in his farewell address, which Hamilton actually wrote. So obviously Hamilton wasn't the biggest fan of it either. He really emphasized neutrality and moving away from political parties. But discussing Madison, who wrote this, do you think, obviously he was against having multiple parties, but do you think he'd be ultimately happy about how our political system turned out with like how it is today with two very large political parties that oppose each other, do work together on some things, but are ultimately like your two choices? Like, you can vote for a third party, but they don't have too much power. So do you think Madison would be happy with that system? Do you think he would believe that it gave people power while also balancing out the dangers of that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And actually, you asking that, I think, will help me clarify something that I probably wasn't clear enough on. I don't think Madison had a two-party system in mind here, in an organized way. And what's interesting is that the Washington was a man that transcended politics, although you had to kind of assume you're not going to have a string of Washingtons. The original two parties saw themselves, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, as the party war to end all party wars. In other words, they thought this was a fight to the death, and whoever won, there would be one party arguing with itself for the rest of time, right? And the Federalist Party actually falls apart after it loses in 1800. It's not really till the 1830s that you get a permanent party system, whereas the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans thought it was over the future of, are we going to be a free or a tyrannical government? In the 1830s, you start to get a permanent party system where the idea is you can be a Democrat and a Whig at that point, later a Democrat and a Republican, yet we can all be Americans. In other words, that parties go from fighting over the future of the country in a fundamental way to being parties that are two different visions for how to move forward under the Constitution, that we're all Americans, even if we're Democrat or Republican. So what would Madison think of it today? I think he would, in general, find a two-party system better than alternatives, even if I think he probably would have a good list of complaints either way for either party. And I think that he would also see that, I'll bring the Electoral College into this, as long as the real reason I think we have a two-party system now is the Electoral College. And why? The Electoral College requires a president to get a majority of the electoral votes. Not the most, a majority of the entire. And as long as the goal for the presidency is a majority, not just a plurality, you're always going to have a self-interested push in the system to have two parties rather than more, because you're always going to be trying to get over that hump of 270 electoral votes. So I think he would look back and say, we kind of put in place something that might move us toward a two-party system, even if I wasn't intentionally thinking of it at that time.
Well, that is...
You're on mute, Janine.
Okay, I'm an actress. Take two. Wow. You've given us so much food for thought. That's really, because if there were more parties, it'd be hard to get the electoral vote over the majority of 270. Really, oh my gosh, well, we could talk forever and ever and ever, but it is 2:00 exactly. And Adam Carrington, Professor Carrington, you have just been terrific today. I've learned so much. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And thank you. But shall we give a big round of applause to Professor Carrington?
Well, thank you all. You all made this a great experience. And Tova, very good questions. I could not have asked those as a high schooler.
Okay, so Tova, and do you want to say any parting words? Is there anything we need to place we can go to find your books or anything?
Oh, for me, sorry, I thought you were talking to Tova. Well,
Yeah.
my book is on Amazon. One thing that people might be interested in is because I do a lot of constitutional law, I do write frequently on the courts, always with an eye to some of these fundamental principles, and I always call June Scotusmas. Jokingly, because that's when all the big Supreme Court opinions come out. So that might be something people might be interested in, because I try to bring these fundamental principles to bear on some of the concrete questions of the Constitution and constitutional law that come out every spring with the Supreme Court.
Well, we'll have you back, because the group consensus when we decide what the shows are going to be with Tova and Cathy and Dakare, we've been thinking about the Supreme Court decisions and everything that's going on. We haven't really talked about that a lot. So we're going to put that in our queue, and we hope you'll come back. And everyone check out your book. It sounds fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today.
A pleasure. Thank you.